social brain. It's been a little bit since our last episode, so we apologize for the delay, but we have been hard working on this one. It's going to be a really fun one. We're talking about consciousness. This is really a culmination of everything we've talked about this year. I think we've done more than 20 episodes this year about all of these different aspects of how the brain functions, the different aspects of all of these mechanisms in the brain. But all of it happens in a space. And that space is consciousness, this really mysterious thing that we'll kind of dig into and talk about. So please don't forget to kind of subscribe to our channels, Cellular Republic and Sense of Mind, and check out our Patreon account if you want to kind of help us out and keep us going. So I'll kick it over to Andrew.
Yeah, and just also throughout this episode, don't hesitate to put some questions or comments in the chat. This will be a really, I think, fun episode because for me, this consciousness, this problem, this idea, it never really hit home for me, like why it was so interesting until I think I was a sophomore in college and I was driving home from like Thanksgiving break or something. No, I was driving back to college after Thanksgiving break. And I was listening, I'm like an audiobook fiend. So I was listening to this book, Waking Up by Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and sort of a philosopher, podcaster. And it just hit me at some point that this is such a fascinating thing. You know, consciousness, this word gets thrown around so much that sometimes it kind of seems to lose meaning, but it just hit me that everything I've considered real, everything that is real to me in this moment, my experience, that's consciousness. That's not to say that the universe and physical reality doesn't exist. It does, but at like your experience of it, your life, everything that's ever occurred and happened to you is consciousness, or it is. That's what we're going to get into right now. So I just want to kind of frame that there may be, if this problem isn't very interesting to you, I hope that this episode can kind of make that shift and help you have that experience I had while driving.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of hit me in a similar way too, because I'd been doing my undergrad, I'd been taking some classes about the brain, and I had started working in a rat lab, kind of researching like memory and all these processes. And I was learning so much about these different mechanisms in the brain, and like this part of the brain does this, and this part of the brain does this. But when you really zoom in on kind of the molecular structure of these things, right? You have a neuron here in the back of the brain, you have a neuron way over here in this part of the brain. If you're talking about biological distances, these things are like hundreds of miles apart from one another, right? And they're both doing their thing, they're both firing or whatever, but they're so far away from each other. And somehow all of this activity that's happening at the same time all over the place in the brain somehow comes together. It's all of these things are glued together into this unified experience that we have, right? We look around the world and we see everything as whole. There's solid structures as all of these things. But even when you get down deeper and you look at like quantum mechanics and atoms and everything, we know that like most of this stuff is empty space, right? And that our brain is taking these waves of light in, these wavelengths of pressure in the air, and it's making them into this experience that we have that is something that allows us to persist, to survive, to keep going, right? But we have to realize that everything we see, the colors that we see, the sounds that we make up, those are all processes that are happening inside of our brain. And this is going to be a really interesting episode because I mean, everybody has an intuition about consciousness, what it is, what's conscious, what's not conscious. And I think what we really want to do in this episode is look at where we're at with the science and kind of we're not experts in all of these theories. There's so many of them. People have been studying these things for decades, but we will
millennia.
For millennia, yeah, right. This has been a philosophical pursuit, right? You go all the way back to even like Kant, like is the outside world even real? Like is everything perceptual? So we're going to try to touch on as much of that as we can, and really kind of show you where the evidence is at, what we have evidence for, what the researchers think is conscious and is not conscious, and it's a really kind of philosophical quicksand that you can get into, but we're going to try to dance that line as best we can.
Yeah. So maybe let's start with some definitions, as we like to do. So consciousness, as I mentioned, is this term that is just thrown around so much that again, it kind of loses meaning, or it can seem that way. And people use it in very different ways. So I think for our purposes, and Taylor, you can modify or correct me, but I would say consciousness is subjective experience. That's to say, if there's anything that it's like to be you, that is consciousness, right? Like, and that comes from mainly from the philosopher Thomas Nagel and others. That the pretty popular definition, especially in the neuroscience of consciousness, is that if there's any sort of experience happening, that is consciousness. Compared to, like, a water bottle. Well, we'll get into this later on, whether inanimate matter may or may not be conscious. But as far as we know, there's something happening inside my head, but not happening inside this water bottle in terms of experience.
And it's kind of a tricky question, right? Like, do we have to have a nervous system? Do we have to have a brain for all of these things to be possible? The essay that you're talking, Thomas Nagel's essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" Really kind of opened up a lot of this stuff. Of there's an experience. There's this word. It's like one of my favorite words in the world, Umwelt. What it's like to be something. We tend to be very anthropomorphic, right? We have this experience of being human, and we try to put that experience on other things. But we have to realize that being a bat probably feels very different than being a human, right? The way that the senses are integrating stuff, the way that it navigates, all of that kind of stuff, the way that it's interpreting bodily signals, we have to realize that there's this experience itself that is the conscious experience. But what I really like to think about in terms of consciousness is that it's like the space that all of that stuff is in, right? Like, we have certain sensory stuff that we have. Our ears, we're very visual dominant, right? Other animals are very smell dominant. But the consciousness is the kind of space that all of that stuff is being fed into. It's I know Sam Harris talks a lot about this, is it being kind of like a mirror of all of those things that are happening to the organism, all the bodily experiences, all the sensory experiences. But like Andrew said, it feels like something. Like that thing has an internal experience. It's usually tied to subsistence.
Yeah. And you mentioned Sam Harris, and also him and a neuroscientist, Anil Seth. I've heard them both say this, that consciousness is the one thing that can't be an illusion. So it's like, even if you are a brain in a vat and everything you're experiencing is an illusion in terms of like you're just in this vat, but you think you're watching this YouTube video, but it's really just a mad scientist playing with your brain. That experience is consciousness. So that even no matter how deep the illusion is, if there's any sort of perception or noticing at all, that is consciousness. So go ahead.
No, I'm just saying. And it's I think the really tricky thing about a lot of this is, why does there have to be an internal experience? Right? We have all of this physical stuff that's happening in our brain, in our body, all of this, all of that stuff could be going on in the dark, right? What makes it so that all of that stuff comes together for us to have an actual agentic subjective experience?
Yeah. That's what, that kind of brings us to, well, I guess we could maybe, we've mentioned some of these other words in here So I think there's a lot of words that get confused with consciousness that it might help for us to kind of differentiate a little bit. So would you say, Taylor, is there a difference between consciousness and the mind?
Oh, it's a tricky one. Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, these words are really hard to define. Because then you get into, I would say consciousness and the mind are very intricately linked to one another. The way that I think about them, because it's, to have a mind is to have an experience of making decisions, of being aware of things, of paying attention to things, and that is all happening inside a conscious experience, right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think they're pretty much synonyms. And but just a couple, just people talk about, is consciousness just wakefulness? Is it just being awake? Well, I would say no, because you can have conscious experiences while you're asleep, while you're dreaming. So it's different from just wakefulness. And then this kind of brings us to what is called the hard problem of consciousness, right? And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but do you want to talk a little bit about that, Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, this is usually contrasted to the easy problems of consciousness. And the easy problems are actually figuring out how all of these mechanistic things work. This is something we've been talking about on this show for over a year, right? How all of these different processes in the brain all come together, right? How attention works, how memory works. Those are things that we can actually find neural correlates for. So we do some kind of experiment. We see this part of the brain lights up when someone's paying attention or when someone's remembering something. And we can really map out this stuff really well. I mean, you can see these like circuit diagrams of how all these different brains are connected to one another and how this information feeds into this one and into that one. But none of that explains why any of it's conscious, right? There was this really good story that we heard in some of the material that we were going through when we got ready for this of there's this blind researcher, right? It's this kind of anecdote. And she spends her whole life studying visual processing, understanding all of the mechanistic pathways involved, from how it goes from the eyes and the retina through the lateral geniculate nucleus and the thalamus out to the visual cortex out here, and then how the visual cortex then builds that in tracks for motion and color and all of these things, and builds it into a perception that has this like 3D kind of thing that we can move around in our head. She understands all of that, how all of these brain regions are connected to one another. And then she has a surgery done, and she has her sight restored to her. She's never seen before in her life. And that day that she sees for the first time, she's going to learn something completely new about vision that she had no accounting for in all of the mechanistic stuff that she experienced. What it's actually like to see the color blue, the color red, what it's like to see motion and all of these things. It's an experience that none of this mechanistic stuff actually accounts for. And that's what really is the hard problem. How do you transfer from all of this stuff that's going on that really kind of gets into a lot of this deterministic stuff of like you have this calcium channel and this sodium channel are causing like this action potential that turns into information that moves around. All of that can be happening in just this physical space. Why does any of that have to be conscious? And what is the kind of special ingredient? That's the hard problem, right? What is the special ingredient that goes from all of this mechanistic stuff to actual subjective experience?
Yeah, and that term was coined by the philosopher David Chalmers, and just giving credit where credit's due there, I guess. But I think that problem of, okay, you can talk about the brain all you want. You can talk about visual processing, sensory processing in general. You can talk about memory, emotion, all these things, how they work in the brain. And it seems to just leave this mystery, this hard problem kind of untouched. You're like, well, interesting, very cool that the visual system works that way, but why is red the way it is? Why is green the way it is? Why is it seem a certain way to me? And I think this leads many people to be skeptical of the idea that the brain is causally involved in producing consciousness, that consciousness is dependent on the physical brain, because they see all this, they go, okay, interesting, but there's this component that is me, this consciousness that still exists beyond or seemingly beyond all these mechanistic explanations. And so I think that leads a lot of people to be like, well, is it really? Are there good reasons to believe the brain produces consciousness? And I think there are. I think there are some good reasons. I think the basic thing to sort of set of facts to get your mind around is that lesioning, so damaging or stimulating the brain in certain ways or certain areas of the brain, results in specific changes to our conscious experience. So we were just talking about the visual system, right? And there's all these experiments on well, really observations of neurological patients, not experiments. That would be pretty unethical, but where they've had some kind of damage to one or another area of their visual cortices. And it results in specific changes to what they're able to perceive, what their conscious experience really is. So there's this phenomenon called blind sight, which sounds really, like an oxymoron, blind sight. But it happens when there's damage to what's called the ventral what stream. So this is a part of the brain, or a part of the visual system that kind of it involves ventral areas of the visual cortex, and it is involved in seeing what is out there in the world, the contents of visual space, like this bottle or my face or whatever, your computer screen you're looking at, those things. And if that's damaged, if that ventral stream is damaged, people report not being able to see, like they say they're blind, right? But if you move something in front of their visual field, in front of their eyes, and you say, which direction did that move in? And they go, I don't know, I can't see, right? I'm blind. But because this other separate stream of visual processing is still intact, which is involved in the motion of things and where things are in space, if you just say, okay, just guess which direction that thing was moving, they get it right more often, or at a higher rate than chance. Yeah. So they're on average, they're actually able to tell which direction something was moving, even though they subjectively report that they can't see the contents of visual space.
This is an interesting distinction, right? Because this is really kind of getting into what it's like to be me, right? As I start lesioning parts of my brain, you have Phineas Gage is this really kind of famous example in psychology. This guy that had a tamping rod from a railroad track go through his frontal lobe, completely changed who he was, completely changed his personality, all of these kind of things, right? And so we know that like the me component, the like what it feels like to be a human, to be Taylor, to be Andrew, can be very easily changed by destroying parts of my brain. The thing that I don't think it accounts for, though, is that I think what that is really explaining is that the contents of consciousness are being produced by the brain. And what I'm not yet convinced of is whether or not consciousness itself, like the thing that's being populated with stuff, requires a brain. Not there yet. I'm always like on the fence with this kind of stuff. And I know that there's a lot of people that come into this kind of stuff that see the hard problem, that they're like, science can't answer everything. There's got to be like spiritual explanations for this, panpsychism, whatever. But I always kind of leaned on the kind of side of saying that, I think that life itself has an experience of being alive, that even down to the single cells, bacteria has like a certain internal representation of their environment. They can predict when things are going to be nutrient rich or not. They can move towards things and away from things. They don't have a nervous system. They don't have a brain. And so is there something else that's being populated that's not being produced by a brain? Is interesting. And I'm not convinced yet. I don't know. And it's one of these things where when you get into a lot of the neuroscience, you start leaning so much more and more into like, yeah, it's got to be brain centric. It's got to be the brain. But it's hard to shake a lot of these intuitions.
Yeah. Well, see, okay. So I hear that, and I'm actually really sympathetic to that view. And I agree that the lesioning experiment, or the lesioning observations I just explained, don't get at that space of consciousness that you're talking about. But I guess there's a couple questions that pop up in my mind when you say a space of consciousness. Could it be that it's not a space per se, it's not a thing, but that perceptions or emotions or these brain processes themselves are conscious? And the only reason I start going, or one reason I start going down that road is when we talk about bacteria or other simpler biological systems being in some way conscious or having an experience of some kind. it leads me to go, okay, well, why is it that only certain parts of my body seem to be conscious?
Yeah.
If they're all this biological system, they're all integrated in a very, complicated way. Why is it that I don't feel my toenail, or the bottom of the heel, the callus on
Yeah.
my heel, versus I feel, my skin, right? But I don't feel my skin if you damage my spinal cord so that I'm, paralyzed from the neck down. So I hear that, and I think we will. The more you talk about this kind of thing, the more that you realize there aren't any simple answers really
No.
to any of this. And so I'm not saying, Taylor, you're wrong or anything like that, but it just poses that question in my mind. Why is it, it seems to have something really closely to do with the nervous system, but could it be that my toe is conscious, my heart is conscious, but I'm just the brain, so I'm not aware. That it starts
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
all kind of get a little fuzzy, I guess.
No, it does. So I have a couple things to say about that. First of all, I think that there's distinctions made in the science between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. So we as humans have this incredible capacity for access consciousness. We're able to subjectively report what it feels like to be something, and I think that form of consciousness does require a lot of information processing systems like the brain, frontal cortex, all of these kind of things to be able to have kind of meta representations of the things that are going on in order to be able to say like, yeah, I am a subjective being, I am a self, I'm exploring this world, whatever. I think the thing that I struggle a lot with is that the more you kind of lean into access consciousness being the only thing that is consciousness, the more you start denying that other living things are conscious, that dogs are conscious, that all of these other like simpler animals. And to me, there, I want to believe it's this dance that I'm always on. I have my wife is very like spiritual and on that kind of side, and I'm very scientific, right? And there's this part of me that always wants to like believe the mysticism stuff. I remember Richard Dawkins came and gave a talk at UNLV when I was in undergrad, and I got up and asked him a question, and he's like this huge fan of Charles Darwin and all of this kind of stuff. And Charles Darwin had this quote that said, "The pursuit of science will turn your heart to stone." And I got up and I asked Richard Dawkins, I said, how do you deal with that idea? Because there's so much like vigor in mysticism, in like it gives meaning to you and purpose to have faith in things, and when you go the science route, you start to say like, oh, okay, well, there's not all of this purpose and fantastical stuff out there, and it starts to turn your heart to stone. And he had a great answer. He said, I feel the most spiritual when I'm sitting there contemplating how small I am in this vast universe, not contemplating Jesus or God or whatever it is. But getting back to kind of the point was that like I have a lot of these intuitions about there being something special about life. And even when you hear like Anil Seth, who's a major kind of neuroscientist that studies consciousness, talk about this, he's very skeptical of artificial intelligence having the capacity to achieve consciousness because he believes that consciousness is embodied, that it has something to do with being alive. And so actually creating a conscious machine would require creating a living machine, or at least a machine that cares about its own persistence over time. And that's something that has always really kind of gotten to me on like, I think that, and you're making a lot of leaps when you do these things, but you look at the behavior of a lot of these living things, and there's this assumption that because they have these behaviors that are approach and avoidance and these kind of things that you would expect in a conscious being, that means there's consciousness there, and there's no evidence for that. That's me kind of having an intuition about it. But it gets to your point too, in the fact that it implies different levels of consciousness, right? That these individual cells have their own experience of being alive, but that there may be some hierarchical thing happening where the more that I like what you said about it not being a space, right? And I kind of regret calling it a space because it implies that it's something physical. And I've always seen consciousness more as a process, right? It's where information is coming together to make a decision. It has intention, it has action associated with it. It's us kind of making sense of the world around us so that we can decide whether we want to approach or avoid or do whatever we need to do to survive. So long-winded
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, no, that makes me think of like theories of consciousness that kind of take this evolutionary angle and say that if maybe consciousness afforded a benefit to organisms because it made like pain, for example, more impactful, I guess, in
Yep.
some way,
Yeah.
and that maybe that allowed those organisms to be more like responsive to their environment in some way. Um, I don't think I'm really capturing that theory really all that well, but no,
Interesting.
I think yeah, I take your point that I feel like it does seem to have something to do with biological systems specifically, and maybe we should kind of transition into some of the theories that have been proposed for what consciousness, how it's produced by the brain. And I guess we should say that all of these theories that we'll mention do take it as a given that the brain is the consciousness producer. So yeah, maybe
Yeah.
the first one, and I guess to kind of credit where we're getting a lot of this information about these theories, there was a recent article by Anil Seth, and I can't remember. Bain was the other last name. I can't remember his first name, but
Yeah.
that was published in Nature, I believe, Nature Neuroscience, and they reviewed the most popular theories of neuroscientific theories of consciousness. So the first one we can jump into is called integrated information theory, and yeah, again, actually, just one caveat before we get into this. I'm not an expert in any of these theories, and so I apologize if I get anything wrong. I'm trying to like cite the experts as closely as I can while keeping this simplified and not getting into like mathematics and all these really complicated things that go along with some of these theories. So that being said, I guess one way to talk about or to explain integrated information theory is that it is a mathematical approach to talk about phenomenology, to talk about conscious experience, where the basically there's this idea of integrated information where a system has causal power upon itself, and that or sorry, cause effect power upon itself, and that arrangement in that system is consciousness. And whenever I say it, I'm like, am I off on that? Like, what's your interpretation of it, Taylor?
No, I mean, it's this idea that our conscious experience requires some integration of information, all right? That our experience is this kind of unified whole, right? That we have our visual experience, our auditory experience, all of these things happening at once that are all kind of coming together. And integration information theory is really looking at what level of integration is required for something to become conscious, right? What kind of information needs to be connected and put together in certain ways. And there's interesting kind of correlates with some of this stuff, right? Where if you they can show that different states of consciousness correlate with different levels of integration and kind of crosstalk between these different regions in the brain. So you have like low levels of consciousness when we're like sleepy, just waking up. There's activity here and here and here, but it's not kind of coming together. It's not integrated in a way. And then fully wakefulness, there's tons of activity that's all kind of crosstalk, that's all kind of coming together and connected. And the idea of it having causal power over itself is this idea that it's kind of this gets back to some of the stuff we talked about, like cybernetics and things, where it's a self-organizing system that the information that's being integrated is allowing that system to then act upon itself to change something, right? It's putting all of that stuff together in order to kind of correct something that's out in the environment, right? a lot of this is usually tied to these predictive frameworks, right? Of
Mhm.
the brain itself is making predictions about how to survive, right? About what's going on. If I do this, what's going to happen? And then all the sensory information that's coming in is then providing error signals about whether or not we were right. If I move my hand this way to grab the cup, did I actually grab it, right? And if I missed it, how do I need to adjust my predictive model to then correct for that? And that is this kind of integrated effect causal loop that's happening. And that, but one of the things that I think Andrew was kind of hinting at that's tough with some of this stuff is that, like, where's the threshold, right? Where why is it this amount of integrated information is conscious and is less not conscious? Can systems that have a certain level of integrated information but aren't kind of humans or something like that, like cells that are talking, right, sending signals back and forth, is that enough for that group of cells to be conscious, to have causal power on itself? We have all of these different systems in our body that are working together in integrated ways to solve different types of problems, genomic problems, cardiovascular problems, toxicity problems, right? Are those things because they have some type of integrated information conscious as well? Uh, so
Right.
that's kind of how I understand it. I
Yeah.
could be off on certain things, but
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And um, we could. I'll just read this extended quote from Christoph Koch, who's a famous neuroscientist who has done a lot to advance the theory of integrated information. And this comes from his book, The Feeling of Life Itself, which I thought was on that shelf, but it's not. And anyway, so it's he says, quote, consciousness is a fundamental property of any mechanism that has cause-effect power upon itself. Intrinsic causal power is the extent to which the current state of, say, an electronic circuit or neural network causally constrains its past and future states. According to IIT, these causal powers are identical to conscious experience, with every aspect of any possible conscious experience mapping one-to-one onto aspects of this causal structure. So, yeah, if that sheds any more light. And one one interesting thing I think about this theory, like, is they talk about how different areas of the brain show higher or greater or lower degrees of integrated information, and that this correlates with kind of brain regions that we more closely associate with like conscious perceptual experience. So like posterior cortical areas, they'll talk a lot about, and this includes like your visual cortex and somatosensory cortex to some extent, and auditory cortex. And they're saying like these regions specifically have actually higher degrees of integrated information, and that explains why you can damage like the frontal lobe and have seemingly little effect on conscious experience, versus when you damage somewhere in the posterior regions of cortex, you typically get some effect, some defect in conscious experience.
and what you're seeing in these posterior regions is a lot of what they call association areas, multimodal areas. So when we're processing sensory information, we have primary sensory regions. So like visual cortex, V1 is processing just vision. A1 auditory cortex is processing just sound. Somatosensory cortex is processing just touch information. But as the activation spreads from those primary regions, it starts to become more elaborated, and then it starts to hit association zones, which are multimodal. So you have these regions of the brain are actually bringing these different senses together and associating them together. So you have a neuron in the visual cortex is going to fire when it sees a line in a particular orientation, whereas a neuron in an association area is going to fire when there's a line at a certain orientation and a sound that's happening, right? That it's now combining these two things and saying these two things, when they're together at the same point in time, have some kind of meaning associated with them. And so you start to see this, like, as you get higher and higher in these kind of integration pathways, the information becomes more meaningful to the kind of survival of the organism. But you'll see, I think an important distinction that Andrew was kind of hinting at that we're going to get into with some of these other theories is the difference between what they think is the most important for conscious experience. So some of these theories think that anterior regions like the frontal lobe are like the main kind of portion that's responsible for us having a subjective experience. And then some of these other theories like IIT and recurrent processing theory are very kind of posterior centric. They think that a lot of these posterior hot zones are what are required.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess just to like put my cards on the table, I would think, at least from what I've seen from like neurological, like lesion observations, that I would like kind of forced to side with the idea that more posterior regions are more important for conscious experience to some extent, because yeah, people can have really severe damage to their frontal lobes and have still report that they're conscious. But and I don't, I mean, does that mean that they're not, that those areas of the brain aren't conscious? I don't know, but it doesn't seem like they're
Yeah.
critical, at least for like conscious experience itself.
And to me, I mean, it's what is being fed into the conscious space, right? And if you're damaging these posterior regions, a lot of that is the direct sensory input to the conscious
Mm,
experience, right? Whereas a lot of the frontal regions are really the regions that are manipulating that information
yeah.
for working memory, for decision making, for executive function. And so that's, I think, the distinction that I like. And so I think that kind of leads into, actually, before we do that, one thing that we have to say about IIT is that there was recently just like a letter penned by like 100 different researchers claiming that IIT was like pseudoscience. And it created a huge kind of Twitter storm debate about a lot of this stuff. You had really kind of big proponents of IIT getting on and really kind of defending the work they'd done for years, that were kind of shocked that these other scientists called their science pseudoscience. But I think a lot of it gets into a lot of what happens in consciousness research, where like the theory itself kind of becomes unconstrained, where now it kind of gets into the land of panpsychism, where you have, if integrated information is what causes consciousness, then any kind of integrated information in any kind of system is conscious, including computers, including like non-living systems. And so where do you draw
Yeah.
the line?
Yeah, I remember one of the talks we listened to. Christoph Koch was asked a question about if you have like visual cortex in a petri dish separated from the rest of the brain but kept alive, um, is that conscious? And his answer was like, yeah, it would have some sort of inkling of like visual experience. And so that's kind of like, you can see the logical extension of this theory starts to get into some what seems like weird areas, but could very well be the case. I guess I'll just mention too about IIT. I think one reason people like kind of brush it aside is it does seem like it's just saying, okay, well, integrated information is consciousness, and that's just kind of like, to me, just saying in like a more sophisticated and more specific and nuanced way, it's basically saying, well, brain activity is consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, but that doesn't explain the phenomenological, like, again, why is red the way, like the color red seems a certain way to me and not another, like so I do see that like there's still this, to me, like unsatisfactory nature of the theory, but that's also probably because I don't understand it as well as the experts do.
So this other theory that we'll get into is one that I like. I'm putting my bias in there, I guess. But so this one I think has gotten a lot of kind of support from scientific studies and even from kind of anatomy and things like that. The global workspace theory. This was put forth by Barr in the 1980s, and it kind of followed along with a lot of what was happening in computer science at the time, honestly, looking at some of the information processing architecture and thinking about the brain as an information processor, right? And that's something that I think we talk a lot about on this show, is that the brain is in this silent dark skull. The brain doesn't see anything, it doesn't hear anything or touch anything. All it gets are neural impulses, and it's somehow making sense of the temporal dynamics of these things and everything, to put all that together into a picture, right? our entire perceptual experience is built off of patterns of firing neurons, right? Which is fascinating in its own right. Uh, but kind of what they think is happening in terms of how this is related to what happened in computer science, there's something called the blackboard kind of software architecture in computer science, and it's this architecture that has access to lots of different types of processing things that are happening in the computer at the same time, right? So it accounts for the fact that there's parallel processing, which we know happens in the brain because there's all kinds of things that are being processed at the same time that we're not aware of. But the blackboard is something that all of these systems, these knowledge systems, these computing systems, decision-making systems, they all have access to. They can write to it, they can read to it, and it's a shared space where all of this stuff is kind of projecting to. And that's the idea behind the global workspace theory, is that the consciousness itself is kind of this blackboard, this workspace, and it's whatever is being fed into it. And this is why one of the reasons I like it is because it accounts for some of the access kind of consciousness that we talked about, where you can damage certain parts of the brain and it changes your conscious experience, but that's because that information is no longer being fed into the workspace in the same way, right? And so whatever's pertinent at the time, this accounts for different types of subjective experience, right? So if I'm in danger, then the regions that process fear signals and things like that, those are the regions that are populating the workspace, right? It really accounts for the fact that like it's probably not in one place in the brain, but it's actually this architecture that's connecting these different systems, connecting attention systems and memory systems that they're all sharing. And there's actually this architectural kind of evidence that they think is accounting for this, that there's layers in the cortex that have long range projections. And so they think that this layer of cortex that has these long range projections is actually creating this kind of shared space around all of these different kind of architectures that are there.
Yeah, and that seems to like at least help explain what's called like the binding problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that like, there's all these seemingly separate processes going on in the brain, having to do with visual perception and auditory perception, but also memory and balance, like all these systems that are seemingly somewhat separate, but in your experience, in your conscious experience, it's all bound together into a unified whole. So it kind of, on some level, it seems like it can't be that these systems are separate. So this global neuronal workspace theories, set of theories, seems to like point at that. Okay, well, all of this information processing is sort of coming together in these in this common space in the brain. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's interesting about it is that it really accounts for the limited capacity ideas, right? That the idea is that this global workspace itself can only hold a certain amount of information. And so there's actually competition to get into the workspace. So there's all this processing that's happening in the brain. It's counting for unconscious processing that we're not aware of, right? I mean, most neuroscientist researchers think that only 2% of what our brain is doing is actually coming to awareness, that we're actually aware of it, right? And so it's this idea that you have all of these systems in the brain that are processing homeostatic mechanisms, right? And this is one of the reasons I really like the theory is because it gets tied back to a lot of this embodied idea that we have certain mechanisms that are tracking salt content, certain mechanisms that are tracking hydration and food intake, certain systems that are tracking threat, all of these things that are homeostatic mechanisms. Like, what do I need to do to make sure that that system feels like it's operating like it should? And when those things go out of balance, then that becomes a reason for it to compete to come into the workspace, right? And now if it's in the workspace, then it's now part of the discussion of what needs to be handled right now. And that's something that I've always had been really interested in is that we, especially as humans, I mean, applies to other animals as well, but we have hundreds of competing needs at any given moment, right? And what determines what thing we're actually giving our attention to, right? Why is it that this feeling gets to attention when these other feelings that are going on don't? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's tied to kind of the homeostatic stuff, the cybernetics of it. I threw that word out, but
no, yeah. Like, and because you're not always you're not constantly conscious of like your stomach, of what your stomach feels like, until something either goes wrong or maybe, I don't know, feels good or just different than usual. And then that becomes this, like, it's this competitive advantage for the representation of like the stomach to get into awareness. So yeah, that it is interesting. It seems like explain that a little bit. So the next set of theories, the kind of the final one I think we'll discuss in a detail like this, is the what's called like higher order theories.
Yeah.
And this isn't really as unified, like these theories aren't as unified as the ones we've been talking about before, but it's kind of like the basic idea behind this is that they said like a mental state is conscious if it's the target of a specific kind of meta-representational state. So if there is in the brain a representation of a representation, that is then that's why it's conscious. It's like this sort of feedback loop of looking back on the representations that are in the brain already, so like representing a representation. And I just said representation like 50 times. So
the really interesting thing about this one, this was a philosopher that proposed this originally, and a lot of it ties into the hierarchical nature of information processing in the brain, which is very intuitive. That makes a lot of sense. And I think something kind of harkening back to what we were saying earlier about like what is consciousness, access versus phenomenal, or whatever. A lot of these theories are getting at what it feels like to be human, our conscious experience as being human, like what we have access to, what we can subjectively report, because you have to really think that the consciousness that we're studying, the consciousness that we can study, is only what people can report on, right? Because we can't ask a worm if it's conscious. We can ask a human. We can't even ask a monkey if it's conscious, right? And so when you're thinking about higher order theory, it's what kind of things do we have access to as subjective humans that we can report? And most of that stuff is meta-representational. And this kind of ties into how a lot of these different brain regions work. We had this whole episode on kind of interoception where we looked at the insula. The insula is this really great example of this, where you look at the anterior insula is this map of feeling states in the body, of temperature and pressure and all of these different things. And then when you get to the middle of the insula, that whole map is then reinstantiated, but then integrated with other information. And then it's reinstantiated again and then integrated with other information. And to the point where you now have this unified meta representation of like, okay, I have all of the lower order states that are now combined with touch and with location information that are now tied with bodily kind of needs. And when you look at any of the information processing in the brain, you look at how perceptions are made, right? You have in the visual cortex, you have a map of the visual field where every single neuron is just coding for a specific line and a specific orientation in space. That stuff is then fed to another layer of neurons that then re-represent the map, but that pick out the things that are important. And then that feeds to another layer that looks for motion and looks for color. And then that's fed to another layer. And so the idea here is that, and this theory is very kind of frontal lobe centric, because the frontal lobe is believed to kind of have some of the highest order representations of all of this stuff. It's got an account of all of the sensory stuff that's going on. It has an account of what our goals are, what our ambitions are, and it's able to combine all of this stuff into kind of a unified whole of experience of I have intention, I have ambition, I have experience, I have feeling. All of that is kind of together, kind of bound up into this moment that we experience.
yeah. And I think just something to mention at this point is we've been pretty cortex centric in what we've been talking about here.
Yeah.
We've been really just focusing on the cerebral cortex, this like outer layer of the brain that seems to do most of this higher order processing. And so it makes sense to focus on the cortex. And a lot of the lesion studies I mentioned are lesions of the cerebral cortex. So, it's not like unfounded, but like Antonio Damasio, we've mentioned him on this podcast before, but he's a neuroscientist who has done a lot of writing about the neuroscience of consciousness, and he talks about that we need to be a little bit less cortex centric and think about these subcortical regions, like especially that are involved in sensory processing, like the thalamus. Because the thalamus is this region that is sort of the sensory gateway to the cortex, where it's receiving information from all the senses except for smell, but it's all the senses are kind of sending information to various nuclei in the thalamus. And his idea, or one of his ideas, is that this is where feelings begin, that this would be like the proto feeling. Like, so if that's true, then maybe we're focusing too much on the cerebral cortex as this like consciousness machine, and maybe there's these subcortical regions that are where it first emerges. But it's
No,
hard to test that.
but I really like this kind of train of thought. Mark Solms gets into this too. He's a big kind of contributor with a lot of Antonio Damasio's work. And I mean, he makes the point that a lot of feeling states, even on like PET scans and MRI scans, are very kind of brainstem centric. That we see the birth of feeling. And he said, we can have unconscious thoughts, we can have unconscious perceptions that are kind of guiding our behavior. And I mean, this may be controversial, but he said, you can't have an unconscious feeling because you have to feel something for it to be a feeling. And so they think that kind of is the basis of what it means to be conscious. And I really like that intuition because it does mean that like other animals have a conscious experience of what it feels like to be alive. It kind of gets back to our Nagel definition from earlier. And it really draws the distinction of what I've been trying to kind of get at in terms of we as humans have all of this extra stuff built on top. And Anil Seth did a really good job of kind of making this distinction. He said, we really have to distinguish between intelligence and consciousness. Intelligence allows us to be conscious in really cool ways, in creative ways. We can like mentally time travel. We can think about the future. We can think about the past. We can deliberate. We can do all of these really cool things with our consciousness. But intelligence is not consciousness. That consciousness is the feeling state of being alive. And I think that really takes it away from this cortex centric thing that's really kind of driving a lot of the neuroscience, is again trying to explain what it means to be conscious as a human, to be intelligent as a human, to be able to make these abstract conceptual representations that describe the feelings. This gets back to one of the very first episodes we ever did on emotion. Like, what is emotion? You get to like these people like Antonio Damasio, Jaak Panksepp, all of these people that talk about the feelings themselves kind of coming from these low order systems, but that all of the emotions are all of this kind of conceptual stuff we're putting on top of it. We're trying to explain why we feel that way and why we're angry and who we're angry at and all of these different things. But that is cortex. That is us really trying to make sense of the moment for us to make more informed decisions about what to do next. But it's that phenomenal component that I think is really tricky to get to. And I think even Sam Harris, something that we looked at, they posed the zombie problem. That this hypothetical thought experiment, right? You have this person that has all of the same machinery as we do, but there's no lights on inside. He's still able to have this conversation that we're having right now, is able to engage, but all of that is just deterministic firing of neurons and all of this kind of stuff. And there's no actual subjective agentic experience. Why does there have to be a subjective experience, right? And that really, I mean, that's going to lead into, I think, our last episode of the year. We're going to talk about free will, whether or not we're making decisions or whether everything is deterministic. But I really like to kind of lean into the feeling side of it. And I know I just kind of dominated the conversation there for a minute. But.
No, that's great. No, I agree. Yeah, whenever I think about the philosophical zombie problem, that was also a contribution of David Chalmers, that I start to think, no, I mean, it's not a valid concept, because if something was if matter was arranged in the exact same way to have a human, then it would be a conscious creature, right? And so like, if we're talking about something that would mimic that, maybe that makes sense. But no, I agree. I think I think this maybe brings us to to a few ideas that we've kind of mentioned throughout this that I feel like we should address, because we've just talked about three really kind of specific theories of consciousness from the brain angle, and there are other ideas that are, you know, equally, I don't know if like equally compelling, but seems like they could definitely be true. And the first one we've mentioned a couple times is panpsychism. And panpsychism is this idea that, okay, there's this hard problem of consciousness. How does matter become conscious? Why is it, you know, why is the water bottle not conscious, but I am? And it's like, you go down far enough and you say, okay, if I could just remove, I mean, this is one way of thinking about it. If I were to remove one neuron from my brain at a time, right, at what point would I stop being conscious? Or would it just be that there would be not a unified consciousness? And maybe, you know, as you break this system down, there's still consciousness associated with all this matter, but the unified aspect of it that I call me and my experience wouldn't be there. And it kind of gets to this idea that Taylor was talking about earlier, where is it true that just life itself, or that even going down to matter, to just atoms and like fundamental particles, could it be that consciousness is a kind of fundamental property of the physical universe, and all matter has some buzzing of consciousness in some way, and the only reason we feel like we're a unified human rather than, you know, like identical with this microphone or the water bottle, is that there's like something going on with the nervous system that's sort of unifying that biological system's consciousness. And you can see as I talk about this, I start to like wander off into fuzziness and not able to really keep my thoughts on track.
No, and I mean, there's very prominent physicists. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but one of the like preeminent physicists of the like 40s, 50s went out saying, you know, consciousness is what we need to solve when we're trying to understand what matter even is. Because something I mentioned earlier is that we have all of these electrons and protons and neutrons that are mostly empty space, but somehow this interaction that causes this subjective experience allows us to see them in a certain way, to experience time. And they've really said, you know, we maybe need to rethink what space-time even is through the lens of conscious experience, that it may be what's kind of binding some of this stuff together. But, you know, it's all hand waving, right?
It kind of is. Yeah. It's like, it could explain it, but it's not, to me, it's not really like satisfying to just say, well, the water bottle is conscious, but it's just like in a different way than you are. It's like, okay, well then there's no problem here, but there still seems to be a problem. That's weird.
Yeah, we got top G, panpsychism or panexperientialism has become very popular today. It has, and it's because of the fact that you can extend these properties so far. And then it also kind of speaks to a lot of the intuitions around kind of mysticism or spiritualism or whatever it may be, that I want to believe that there's other things like me that can experience the world, that can experience the universe. And if we start to apply it to like all things, then we have to start applying it. We have to start making those distinctions. Like Andrew said, it's like, okay, even if it is living things, how does something become living? Is it 2,502 particles and now it's living and not 2,000, you know? Like, where is that distinction made? And an easy way to kind of subvert all of that is just to say that, you know, consciousness has been part of the process the entire way up. So anyway.
Yeah. And one that is kind of more, I guess, more on the like mystical side of things, that kind of like, it seems a little bit compelling to me, is the idea that we're like, the brain is like a consciousness radio, like a consciousness receiver. Like there's this fundamental field, much like there's this electromagnetic field permeating the universe. Perhaps there's this field of consciousness that only certain you know, receivers like brains are able to sort of capture and channel in some way. Like we're receiving consciousness from the universe, and that's why it seems like brains are conscious, but other things aren't. But it's, I mean, again, like I don't think it really explains all that much. It just is like, okay, well, then should we be looking for a consciousness field, and what would that even look like? And yeah.
And I think what we're running into with so much of this stuff are the limitations of science, right? We like to think that we're so advanced in terms of being able to study these things, but we have really crude tools. Even like an MRI machine is this amazing technological advancement, but it's incredibly crude. Like we're looking at brain activity that happened 6 or 7 seconds ago, right? We have to wait for all the blood flow to come in, and we're not actually measuring right now what's happening. And we're not measuring every single neuron that's firing. We're not measuring whether it's inhibitory or excitatory. There are so many pieces of this puzzle that we can't even put together yet because we don't have the right tools to measure it. And that's where it's nice to be able to kind of live in this like speculation space of saying, this is a cool theory if we can get there. But yeah, I really like Aldous Huxley's Mind at Large, or what he called the reducing valve of consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he had the book, The Doors of Perception, right? Where I was talking about his experience on some psychedelic, I can't remember right now, that was a cactus that
peyote.
Yeah, or what? Yeah, mescaline. Yeah,
Mescaline,
and how
yeah.
he was saying like that sort of opened the doors of perception. I've not read that book, but I've heard other people talk about it. So yeah, and then so yeah, this kind of brings us, I think, a conclusion that's maybe somewhat depressing, but I think could be the case that maybe we're just cognitively closed to what the solution is. Maybe there won't ever be a theory of consciousness that fully satisfies us. Maybe we just can't, as humans, wrap our minds around what consciousness really is. Maybe it's too complex. Maybe it's just outside of our, cognitive limitations. Like a dog can't understand quantum mechanics. Human beings may not be able to understand consciousness. But yeah, so I guess we're leaving you with a bit of a total mystery. If I think a great resource, if you want to dive into this in more detail, is guys, Anil Seth.
You just haven't partaken of the DMT.
Oh, I haven't done the DMT. I've done some of the others, but yeah, no, not that one. But the thing, yeah, Anil Seth, a guy we've mentioned on this episode a bunch of times, wrote this book called Being You, and it's this it's kind of a review of like consciousness, the science of consciousness, and he goes into a lot more depth than we did here on a lot of these theories and others. So I would definitely recommend that book.
I think something that I kind of wanted to close with is, despite us not having kind of this really kind of this answer that feels good or whatever, something that you can lean on is that what we do know about consciousness can be really helpful for you in understanding your own experience, right? Because we do know, like Andrew was talking about earlier, we kind of mentioned that the information that makes it to consciousness is important, right? And it can be changed by lesions or whatever it may be, but all of that stuff is getting to awareness for a reason. And if you're thinking about like therapeutic techniques or any of these kind of things, the stuff that makes it to consciousness is usually the stuff that needs to be addressed, the feelings, the pain, all of that kind of stuff. The way that I really like to think about this is that the conscious space is the space where the biggest decisions need to be made for the organism to be able to persist. It's where our long-term goals exist. It's where all of the feeling states that challenge what we need to be thinking about right now versus this versus that, right? It's where deliberation happens. And if you can kind of realize that all of that stuff is being fed into that space for a certain reason, it allows you to kind of interact with it in a different way that may be kind of helpful for you. So again, I mean, it's a really cool thing to think about this. I mean, this is a fascinating topic. I think everyone has an opinion on what it is and what it isn't. I think the theories right now are very impoverished. They don't experience kind of different types of mental states like psychedelics, any of that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of work left to do, but I hope that this really kind of opened your eyes to how cool the problem is in general. And kind of where the science is with trying to understand it.
Yeah. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks, probably, to talk about, we'll definitely be back, but maybe a
Yeah.
couple of weeks, we'll talk about so an equally interesting and kind of seemingly intractable problem of free will. So the next episode, that's what we're going to be talking about, which will tie into a lot of what we talked about here today. But yeah, just want to thank everybody for watching and all the activity in the chat. Really just appreciate all you guys being here and just hanging out with us.
Awesome. We will see you guys for the next one.